Welcome to Season 2 of WitchLit, a space to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. Madame Pamita is a candle maker, spellcaster, tarot reader, teacher, author, and a maker of magic, music, and mischief. She is the host of 2 podcasts, Baba Yaga's Magic and Magic and the Law of Attraction. She's the author of 3 books, Baba Yaga's Book of Witchcraft and the Book of Candle Magic, both published by Llewellyn, and also Madame Pamita's Magical Tarot, published by Wiser Books. And finally, she's the proprietress of the online spiritual apothecary, the Parlor of Wonders. Madame Pamita, welcome to WitchLit.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Witches getting together, having fun, and talking about my obsession, books. I'm happy always to do that.
The best obsession, right? The only thing that isn't considered hoarding is if it's books.
I would question, if you would look at my house, I think you might question that because I'm not even going to say I'm running out of bookshelf space. I have long ago. And now I'm at the point where I'm having to okay, you guys are going to be the second tier and you're going to go in the shed and I'm going to keep my first string out here.
Yes. Yeah. I had to make a lot of decisions when we downsized to an apartment and it was really painful. So I feel you. And now it's just creeping back up. Now that I have new spaces, it's just creeping back up. So. But our first question for everybody is why write?
Oh my gosh. I could say going back to my childhood, well, I grew up in a family. We were talking before we started recording about my family. Half of my family is Ukrainian, which we're going to, I'm sure, talk about that. But the other half of my family is from Tennessee and from the South and from the East Coast South. I would consider Tennessee. Well, I'm in California, so everything's East Coast to me. But and my grandmother was an amazing storyteller, and like many Southern women, I think, was an amazing storyteller. And I can remember when I was a little girl, she would play this game with me where she would say, "Okay, pick 3 things, and I'll make up a story around it." And I thought that was just the most magical thing you could do. Now I look at it and I go, big deal, right? You can make up a story. I mean, I'm sure the stories were not, but she was a storyteller and a writer. And so I think I grew up in a very rich environment. I was always a reader. I loved to read. I would sit with a book for all day and sit and read a book. Alice in Wonderland was my favorite book when I was a little girl. And I'd read it over and over and over again, and Through the Looking Glass, of course, too. And so I think when you grow up in that rich environment where you appreciate words and you have that enjoyment of words, eventually you want to start to tell your own stories. Mm-hmm. So I pick 3 things and I make up a story around them, I guess.
I don't know. I do think that there is a through line for a lot of writers that they do come from families where story is very important. I think you either you become a reader as an escape artist, which I think a lot of writers do too, or you are born into a family where people are natural storytellers. I mean, because as we were talking before, my family is also the Appalachian part of my family from Tennessee, also storytellers and musicians. And, it definitely was part of it. And I grew up in a house full of books. So,
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because when you think about that, my son, who's in his 20s now, is majoring in creative writing. He's in a college program, an undergraduate program at UC Riverside for creative writing. Mm-hmm. And he has that. And we constantly were listening to, back then they were books on cassette tapes, believe it or not, yeah. The old technology, then CDs, and then later we got to streaming, but we were always listening to books and reading books, and there were always books in the home. And so I think coming up in that environment, you gain an appreciation for story and what story can do for you, and sitting down and reading a book, which is becoming, I don't know if it's becoming a lost art, but I think there are people who are real readers and who really enjoy that journey and that relationship that you get with a book. You can develop relationships with your books, mm-hmm. I think.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that environment is really having that rich environment is important. So it's really important that we, even if you're not a super reader, that we read to your kids and your grandkids, that you read to them and give them that opportunity that if then it hooks them, then they can do something with it, whether they become a reader and a person who loves to expand their mind in that way, or they become a writer. But I don't think I ever thought I was going to be a writer. I never thought I was going to be a writer, but I love it now. It's like my super passion, you know?
Yeah. So speaking of becoming a writer, so what did that journey look like to go from this person who valued story and reading to actually getting, because you have 3 books out now, correct?
Yeah. So I have my first book was an interesting story. So as a WitchLit person, you're going to be very familiar with Judika Illes. Mm-hmm. Judika is the author of the Encyclopedia of 5,000 Spells, which is a phenomenal book. Mm-hmm. It's my copy is really tatty because I'm always looking in it. It's got that dust jacket that's all dog-eared and messed up and all that. But Judika and I connected over the internet. We just loved each other. You know, we loved what the other one was doing. Of course, I loved her. I was super fan of her. And then she saw what I was doing. And she reached out to me one day and said, "What are you writing right now?" And we barely knew each other. Oh, I know what it was. I had in my podcast. In fact, you can hear it. If you go back to my podcast, Magic and the Law of Attraction, in episode 2 or 3, I talk about color magic. Well, I make a reference to a beautiful spell that she has in 5,000 Spells about using these I think they're like little tablets that you put in the bath that turn the bath water color. And I said, oh, you can immerse yourself in color magic in ways that ancient Egyptians did with light and color and all of these things. This is, very old magic, looking at color as a way to shift energy. And it is vibration of light, Mm-hmm. So I go into all of that, but I talked about this thing that she recommended, what I thought was so brilliant, which is to take a bath in color. And so I wrote to her and I said, "Hey, check out my new podcast episode. At 12 minutes, whatever, I talk about your spell that you talk about in your book." And she said, "Hey, what are you writing right now?" And at that time, I was trying to come up with a program for love magic, to teach clients love magic. And I said, "Oh, I'm working on this." And she says, "Well, who's putting it out?" I said, "I am. I'm a DIY kind of person." She says, "Why don't you write a book? You want to write a book?" And I was like, "I can write a book?" And I'm the kind of person who goes, "Sure, I'll do it. What's the worst that can happen?" Right? So she said, "What do you want to write a book about?" And I said, "Well, I've always wanted there to be a tarot book that sees the cards from the possibilities of the cards and working with the cards magically, how you can work with them more projectively, not just receiving information." So that's when Madame Pamita's Magical Tarot got written, and it was because of Judika. So I will say she's the fairy godmother of my books, mm-hmm. all of my books, because if it wasn't for her reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, do you want to write a book?" I would never have written a book, because it's such a long process. I'm usually a person, I'm a Cancer, so I'm a cardinal sign. I jump in, I start things, and then I want someone else to finish,
The planner.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just like get started. Hey, let's get this show on the road. But then everybody else has to keep the engine mm-hmm. going, is what ends up happening. So if it weren't for having an editor that says, "Hey, there's a deadline. Hey, you got to do this," very few books for me would get written. Yeah. So Judika really is the impetus. And so I like to now do what she did. And I say to people, "Hey, are you writing a book?" If they have something to say and I can see that they're writing, maybe it's a post on a social media or something, I always say, "Hey, do you want me to make an introduction at my publisher or get you started?" I can't obviously I'm not, mm-hmm. don't have the power to say yes or no, but I can give them that information and get them started and even get them thinking about that idea that they could write, because someone did that for me. So yeah. That's how it started.
There is this, it's funny. Judika hasn't come up as the fairy godmother before. Heather Green from Llewellyn has come up a lot as the fairy godmother of books for a lot of people. And it is funny to me, like it's to be in such a niche world of publishing. There really are like a handful of people that seem to connect to all of these different threads of stories that I find really fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, Judica is just amazing. She was the editor on my tarot book. And then it was so wonderful, knowledgeable. I mean, the notes that she gave were so, just showed her brilliance and her knowledge. And she was so sweet because she said, wow, this book, is about the Rider-Waite-Smith, really looking deeply at the symbols in the Rider-Waite-Smith. And she's like, I've been around the decks for decades, and you are pointing out things that I have never seen before, because I went very deeply into the drawings and very deeply into the symbolism in the cards. So we had a great experience working together, and I just love her.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And so how did the next books happen? Because those are both with Llewellyn, right?
So then the next book I wanted to do was a candle magic book, and Weiser was the publisher for my tarot book, and they passed on it because they already had candle magic books. So then I had met Alicia Gallo over at Llewellyn, who does the magic. She's the acquisitions editor for the magic category. And so I brought it to her, and she said, sure. And so then we made, really every book that I write is coming from the place of, I want this book to be out in the world. This is a book that needs to be out in the world. It's something that is different than what's out there. And I will never write a book. I guess I'll never write a book that is already there. If it's already there, I've read it and I've enjoyed it and I appreciate it. And there's no need to write it, you know? So with the book of Candle Magic, I wrote it from the place of, there are tons and tons and tons of books out there about candle magic, but they're recipe books. There's no book out there that teaches you how to be a chef, right? So, the difference, if you're a cook, between following a recipe, which anyone can do, and the person who goes into the kitchen and goes, oh, I'll take a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I know how to do it. I know the techniques, and I'll make an amazing meal from what we have available right now. And so I wanted there to be that kind of a book about candle magic, which would teach people from the ground up, from the foundation, so that they could create their own spells and not just follow a recipe. And so that's what the book of Candle Magic is about. It has a few recipes for examples, to give examples of things, but it tells you how to make candles, how to craft a simple spell, how to craft a super complex layout with multiple candles, moving candle spells, timings of spells, reading the wax and the flame, and every aspect of this amazing world of candle magic that, and I don't think there is a stone that was left unturned in me looking at that. And I have never had anyone say, hey, why don't you have this in your book? It's all in there. Yeah.
That you making that analogy about the difference between a cook and a chef and pulling it made me think of your grandmother's storytelling. Like that's kind of the difference.
Yeah. Yeah. When we were talking earlier, we were talking about, that idea that my grandmother would make up these stories out of thin air. And to be able to do that takes a real, I think, just a real gift to be able to trust yourself. It's about trusting yourself and having confidence. She had confidence in her storytelling ability to be able to say, give me any three things and I'll turn it into a story. And so I would give her, come up with the things in my imagination, and I would try almost in a way to try and make them really different, to see if she could do it, almost in some way testing her. How is she going to make a unicorn and a bicycle fit into a story?
It's a mystery basket approach. Here's your sole fillet and some asparagus and some Fruit Loops. Make a dish.
Exactly. So, and then after that book was completed, I got very passionate about my Ukrainian heritage and learning about Ukrainian magic. And there was nothing out there. Very little about Slavic magic and nothing about Ukrainian magic. And the stuff that my maternal grandmother was doing, and when I would hear stories from my mother. So I started doing research, and I really my Candle Magic book was the easiest book I'd ever written. It was, of the three, it was the easiest. It was just rolling off along because I've been doing Candle Magic for decades. Then I got cocky and I said, oh, I'm going to write a book I know nothing about, or I know just the bare sliver about. And I had to, that book, Baba Yaga's Book of Witchcraft, was it was like a doctoral thesis. I had to learn to read Cyrillic. I had to go figure out how to translate documents from Ukrainian or Russian into English. I had to do research on the history of Ukraine. I had to do, oh my gosh, it was insane the amount, but it was a great education. But there were many times that I was like, what the hell did you just get yourself into? You are an idiot. That's what I would tell myself. I'm like, what am I doing? But perfect project for COVID. I mean, it was during COVID and I was staying at home. I wasn't going out. And so why not write a crazy, complex, deep research book that blazes a trail during that time? Yeah. Perfect timing for that.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny you said that about the learning story. So we talked a little bit before, and I spent some time in Slovenia, and actually my fiction series is based in Slovenia. Like, it's set in Slovenia and has a lot of Slovenian folklore in it. And I hit that same wall with research. There's just not much what is out there. A lot of it is Victorian invention, or it's mostly Russian. There's very little like Southern, Western Slav information out there. And thankfully I did not have to learn Cyrillic, because Slovenian is not in Cyrillic. And I had studied Slovenian, so I had a little bit of help with kind of finding that stuff, but I relied so heavily on people who were generous with their time to find a lot of information.
Yeah.
So it's
oh my gosh, so much. Yes, so much of that. Like I had, I mean, there's dialects in Ukrainian as well. I mean, it's not just, I mean, it's the thing that I think most people can understand is we are seeing it now in what's happening with the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, how, there's a Russian imperialist, kind of governmental thing. That doesn't mean that every single Russian person is an imperialist, but believe me, there has been great propaganda about that. Yeah. And we can see this in Celtic culture, where England has imposed English on Welsh people, on Irish people, and on Scots, so that they have to learn to speak the dominating culture's language, and then they lose their language, they lose their culture, they lose these things, or they get buried and they have to be dug out again. Fortunately, in those countries which we speak, we have that common language, so we know more about them and what's going on there. We see that they have dug up and found these old things that were buried under this layer of governmental oppression, Christianity over paganism, et cetera, et cetera. And now we have an additional thing with Eastern Europe, which is we had 80 plus years of Soviet rule where all religion, all culture was really heavily suppressed, even to the point that some practices like creating pesanki, which are the decorated Ukrainian Easter eggs, only people high up in the mountains, where they were sort of secreted away, or the diaspora Ukrainians who came to Canada, the States, and Australia, or other countries, were the only ones carrying on this practice, because people in the areas where there was government eyes looking at them were not allowed to do it because it was seen as religious. So these folk practices that had been there for thousands and thousands of years, we actually had diaspora Ukrainians bringing it back to Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's crazy. So yeah, it's a very, that's how buried it was. And I'm sure in Slovenia, it was the same thing. Do you know that my illustrator in the book is from Slovenia?
No, I didn't know that. That's so wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah. And the book is beautifully illustrated. If people haven't seen it yet, the cover and the interior is it's such a gorgeous book.
Yeah. Sarah Concilia is the illustrator, and she lives in the UK now, but she's from Slovenia. And so it was so beautiful to work with her, because she really deeply understood this. And her business name is Yaga Sara. And so she has a deep love of Baba Yaga, or Baba Yaga, or however you want to say it, and of this spirit, that I connect to so deeply as well. So yeah.
And I think there is a lot. I mean, Yugoslavia was weird in that it wasn't really under Russia as much as it was under Tito. So there are some differences, but I think with a lot of the rest of Slavic Eastern Europe, I mean, it was kind of bulldozed by Russia. And during that period, so much stuff was buried, like you said, or lost. And thankfully, there were people in the diaspora holding on to those things. Like I think in for Slovenia, like in the United States, Cleveland, Ohio is like the center of Slovenian culture. And it's just, a place that you would not think of, but that's where a lot of Slovenians came after the war. So it is a funny thing how those things survive in these far-flung places. But that must have made, I would think, the research so challenging because you're dealing with Cyrillic and all of the different dialects and all of those things. I mean, that had to be kind of magical in itself, just uncovering these things that had been hidden, or at least not for English speakers or Westerners to really see on the same level.
It's even hidden for Eastern European people. A lot of Ukrainians are learning Ukrainian.
Yeah.
I mean, they're studying Ukrainian, and a lot of Ukrainians are learning about their culture, now in terms of this pagan culture, this ancient culture. Mm-hmm. It's sort of obviously more known to them than to me, growing up in the States. But it's not as if this is something that's widely known or widely celebrated or anything. So there's been so much oppression and so much pressure to adopt the dominating culture that a lot of things were not learned or not taught. And so now people had, in the last 30 years since Ukraine had its independence, there's been a revival. That's why you see Ukrainians wearing embroidered shirts, the embroidered vyshyvanki, because this is their thing that they're very proud of. And there's a real specific pagan element to these things. And it's not taken for granted. It's not sort of gone like, well, whatever. People are like, oh my gosh, this is our thing that makes us special. Mm-hmm. So we're finding that thread is very treasured. All these things are treasured, and they are not well known even within Ukraine because so many, 80 plus years of not being able to teach it or being suppressed, So, yeah. But interestingly, when you bring up the different cultures we see in the former Yugoslavia and the Balkan countries and the former Yugoslavia, even in the Baltic states like Lithuania and up north, we see a lot of commonality and shared shared stories and shared belief systems and stuff, which tells us things like Baba Yaga is really, really old, like prehistoric old. Yeah. This idea of the forest grandmother is a really old spirit. I think, and from my research, my belief is that she really is a spirit, and she's an animist spirit that predates gods and goddesses, which came about later, Yeah.
And I do like that aspect of how that kind of primeval forest of Europe was its own animist spirit. I mean, and it's funny. I've been studying my father's family was German. My last name is German. So I've been studying German and trying to figure out my ancestry on that side because it's a complicated mess. But, just that the idea that the word wilderness that we have in English is from the idea that primeval forest had its own will. That's where the word comes from. So cool. And I was like, and that's animism in our language in English that we don't think about every day. So,
oh my gosh. Well, you brought up another thing that I think you get it as a writer, you get it. You said, it was like the discovery process. For me, one of my favorite movies, this is so cornball, but one of my favorite movies is Aladdin, the Disney Aladdin, the old cartoon Aladdin.
With Robin Williams,
which I think is such a brilliantly written piece of movie, by the way. Just like pacing on it is like perfect in terms of plot points and story motion and everything. I mean, I love it for that as well. But when he goes into the Cave of Wonders and it's like filled with jewels, I felt I had that experience. So when I was really at the proto place of this book even coming to be, like I was just interested in researching on my own with no idea for a book in my head yet. I was like, my grandmother, I heard stories about my grandmother doing this thing. My mom said, yeah, she used to do this thing where she would hold a bowl of water over someone's head and pour beeswax into it. And then she would kind of it was like for healing, but she would like read their fortune. And I was constantly looking for what the heck was that? And then I would look and I'd look. And then when the internet came about, I would kind of like say pouring wax into a bowl and then I found things about like lead reading and this and that and the other thing, but nothing quite added up to the stories that my mom told me. Then my friend, Kitty Carpets, who runs a shop in Canada, she's Ukrainian Canadian. She has a shop in Canada called thewitchery.ca. That's her website. Online store. I always like would go over to her online store and go a little poking around, see what she had and buy some books and buy some of this and that because she has great Slavic and Ukrainian stuff. Right. So I was looking at this book and it's called The Word and the Wax, and it's the Ukrainian wax healing ceremony. And I was like, that was like me saying open sesame and the cave opening and me finding the jewels. When I got that book, it was like, this was my mom was talking about my grandmother doing. And the fact that there was a book this was a doctoral thesis of the author writing about this ceremony as it was practiced by the diaspora in Canada was my little thread that started me on this. If it wasn't for that book and wasn't for me being able to find one thing in English and Ukrainian, it was a bilingual book. I was like, yes, there is information out there. I can find about these practices that my grandmother did and that my mom told me about and that we did when we were growing up and so on. And there is information out there. So when you say that thrill of discovery, it to me was like finding that cave of wonders. And the closest thing I can describe it to is when you were in pre-internet times when you would discover a band, because I'm a musician, I'm super passionate about music, and you find a band and you're like, oh, I love this band. And you discovered it. And then you held it so close, like it was, your own personal jewel that you discovered this band by accident or stumbled upon it, or you went to a friend's house and you heard it on a record player. That was that feeling, that same feeling like, oh my gosh, I just walked into something and now I get to discover more. And then that cave leads to another cave and to another and another. And then you start discovering more and more. So that's the thing that you were talking about. And I know, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that.
Yeah. It's funny you bring up the band thing. I had this conversation. I mean, because we're both Xers, my husband and I are both Xers. And we've had this conversation a lot, like what it was like to be a teenager in the 80s. And like you said, run across this band by accident because a friend had it, because somebody left a tape in your car, whatever. And then it opens this whole magical world of, I mean, that was how I discovered the Pogues. Like a boyfriend lent me a tape of the Pogues. And so I went down this whole alley of Irish punk music because of him. So it's just these funny connections you make. And that discovery of that book makes me also think about, like, especially these less known forms of, either Western European, Eastern European magic, far-flung places, countries in Africa, countries in Asia that Americans don't have that much connection to. So much of that seems to be coming through these weird academic wormholes. Like, it's not really coming from, I mean, I think it is coming from practitioners of diasporas in the United States too, but it seems like there's so much academic work happening around paganism and witchcraft and magic all over the world that I feel like, I think I've said this on the podcast, or someone else has said this on the podcast, that we really are in this kind of golden age of knowledge and publishing in this realm. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think I bless those ethnographers who go in and find out. And what I found for me in particularly looking at Ukrainian stuff, there was a huge blossoming in the mid 1800s. There was a real renaissance in terms of literature and people documenting things and writing things down and collecting stories and all kinds of things. And then the teens came out, 19 teens and 20s came around, and then it was all shut down. A lot of intellectuals were murdered. A lot of, people who were creatives were sent to gulags and all kinds of things just to shut down that the blossoming of this independence movement and this independent culture that really wanted to say, we're different than your culture. And so you find that, and now there's a new blossoming happening, which is so lovely to see. And the internet has been extremely helpful in that,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the good things about the internet. I think those connections and people being able to access that knowledge and do better research and more far-flung research that they wouldn't have been able to do with travel. So it's, that's in many ways a good time to be alive. In many ways a confusing and awful time to be alive.
But when we all decided we wanted to come and be heroes and heroines and sheroes, this is our time to be able to do that in whatever way. And it can be small ways. It can be writing, writing can make you, I think writers are heroes. The writers are always the ones that are sharing information. Information is power, know?
And I do think, I don't know, like when times like this are rough, and I had not planned on going down this rabbit hole with you, but I think it's important. And I think it speaks to a lot of your work too. But I think it is sometimes difficult as a creative to say, what is my contribution? Like when I'm not on the front lines, I'm not doing whatever, but you're right. Writing and knowledge and story is so important. And they do come after the intellectuals. I mean, that's, part of what happens with these regimes. But I always think of the Neil Gaiman story that he tells about the women in concentration camps. And one of them would have a copy of a book and they would stay up all night and read. And then they would tell the story the next day, that they would just cling to some kind of story to get through what they were experiencing and how important that is. And so I do think about that a lot, especially on those days when it's dark and you're like, what am I doing? I think it's important.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, we can do a lot more than we think we can. It really, when you're in an oppressive regime, they want you to feel powerless because what they see is your power.
Right.
So I think that what we're experiencing in the States right now is this last gasp of white supremacist patriarchy who sees the sparkle and the shine and the power of people of color, of women, of LGBTQ people. And that's that they're trying to trick you into thinking you're powerless. And their agenda can make you feel powerless. I don't say that feeling is wrong or bad, but remember that what that is coming from is from them seeing your power. Right. Because if you don't see something as a threat, you ignore it. Why would you, if something is not a threat, why do you attack it? You don't. So the fact that you're being attacked is the fact that they're seeing you have great power. So then you start to realize that my little tiny contribution, whether that's liking a post, sharing accurate information, making a $5 donation, all of that, you may think it's a little thing, but when the vast majority of people, which all of those groups that I mentioned are the majority of people in this country. Right. When we all start doing it, it becomes a tidal wave. Yep. That little drop turns into a tidal wave. Yeah. And that's the beauty. That's the beauty of the individual. So yes, individually, we might do something, but collectively, we can do a whole hell of a lot. And just remember your power. Yeah.
Yeah. That's such it's just a good, hopeful thing, I think, for people to think about now. And, I'm glad you said that, because I do think it is important to remember that, they don't come for you if you don't have power.
Exactly. You're not a threat. If you're powerless, if you're truly powerless, you aren't a threat. Obviously a threat needs to be suppressed. So then you start to say, hey, wait a minute. Watch out, world.
That's right.
Here we come.
So I guess kind of a segue into that. So I would imagine, like, with this discovery of this book from witchery.ca, which I love, by the way, too. It's such a great resource. But like with that discovery and then kind of the seed for this book, and then how did this kind of research, because I'm sure you learned things that you did not know before you set out. So how did it deepen or change your practice around Baba Yaga or around your heritage in general? Like, what was the process? Did the process of writing the book impact how you practice?
Well, yeah, definitely. One of the things that I look at, and when I look at that book and I talk about Ukrainian magic and I talk about Ukrainian paganism, I think this is not unique. I wouldn't even dare to say this is unique to Ukrainian practice, but it certainly is highlighted in Ukrainian practice, which is that I talk about it even in chapter 1, that everything that was in a Ukrainian home, and this book is very homey. It's a very homey book. It's a lot of home crafts because we're looking at a solitary witch. Baba Yaga is solitary. So she's going to be doing homey stuff. She's not going to be doing communal ceremonies. She's not going to be doing celebrating holidays, getting together with the neighbors. She's practicing as a solitary. So I then, created this book about solitary witchcraft. But one of the things that I really saw became evident is that in Slavic paganism, and particularly and I think as I said, I don't think it's unique, but it's very highlighted, which is that things were useful, beautiful, and magical. Mm-hmm. So I give the example of a spoon, a wooden spoon. A wooden spoon is useful. It's useful for feeding your family, putting food into plates and bowls and things like that. But the spoon would be decorated to make it beautiful. There'd be, some pyrography, I think it's called, the wood burning or painting or design or carving in that wooden spoon. But the carving wasn't just decorative. It was magical. Mm-hmm. So there would be symbols carved into the spoon that would be symbols of bounty and abundance and health and protection. So that every single thing in your home became a magical item. Everything in your home, your clothing that you wore, the loom that you wove on, the stove that was painted with magical symbols, the plants around your house. I mean, everything would be done with an intention. And I think that what that has created for me is the idea that the mundane is magical, and the mundane and magic every damn day. Magic for me has become more and more about a daily practice that's little, right? Mm-hmm. I leave an offering for my house spirit every other day. Let's be real. It doesn't happen every day. My house spirit's okay. He knows. But I have like things that are around my house that are magical, and they're utilitarian as well, and beautiful as well. Mm-hmm. And so to create that environment is a different way of looking at the mundane. Then your daily life becomes magical. And that's something that has evolved for me. Whereas before, 40 years ago, I was doing magic. Oh, I'm going to do the full moon ritual, and then I forget about it for a month, and then I'm back to the full moon. But that's a more Wiccan way of practicing. Maybe I don't know. Wiccan. I can't. It's nothing disparaging against Wiccans at all. But you see what I'm saying? It's instead of looking for the opportunity to do magic, your magic is just integrated into your life, and that's how really Baba Yaga would be, and that's how pagan Ukrainians would be doing this, would be having that. Everything's beautiful, useful, and magical.
Mm-hmm. And I love how you structure it in the book. Like each chapter starts with part of the story of Vasilina or Vasilisa. Some people may know the story that way. And then and Baba Yaga is going to talk to you directly. And then Madame Pamita is going to explain this to you. Like each chapter starts that way. And I love how it's set up because it really does. It's such a writerly book in some ways because of this like element of storytelling. Like I haven't read a lot of, magic or pagan or witchy books that have that element of storytelling on top of this very practical guide to do magic. So I think that piece is really interesting. And I love Baba Yaga's personality in the book. And the sass is so lovely. So I just really like the way the book is structured. And I read it fairly quickly because I knew I was going to be interviewing you. And I have like lots of dog ears and Post-its to go back and look at things. But I do think that practicality of the everyday, and I was thinking like how I think humans naturally do that. Like I think about everybody who has computers with stickers all over them. It is kind of that same thing. It's just like these little things we do to make an object ours. Like you buy a mass produced computer and then you cover in stickers to make it yours and make it more beautiful than, whatever the elves at Apple make it look like. So
yeah, I'm not a minimalist by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a maximalist, I guess. But I think about that idea. Well, I mean, the structure of the book, I have to give full credit to Alicia Gallo, my acquisitions editor, because I came to her with kind of a first pass at the book, and it was kind of a mess. I mean, as they all are. I have a little post-it note. This is great for writers. I will give you a really good tip. This sustained me. I had a pretty big post-it note above my desk, and it said, "Your job is to write a crappy first draft." And that helped me focus so much, because I would go like, oh, this is terrible. And instead, my natural writing style is to go back and fix it and get polished and do it no, you got to plow through and get that first draft done. So when I came up with the draft, Alicia was like, I really can't tell the difference between your voice and Baba Yaga's voice. It sounds really like, what's going on here? We need to really divide this up. And then the idea of having the story interwoven, that came from me, because I was like, I thought everybody knew who Baba Yaga was, because I grew up with her. I thought, this is like, everybody knows who she is, right?
Now they all think she's John Wick.
I know. It's ridiculous. It was a mistake by the people that were doing that movie. It's so funny. But anyway, having the realization, when I was talking to even my witch friends, I was like, maybe lay people wouldn't know, but some witch friends didn't know who she was. I'm like, crap. Okay. Do I write a whole chapter about her? I go, she's not going to fit in a chapter, and her story isn't going to fit in a chapter. So let me take this story of the Afanasia version was Vasilisa the Brave, or Beautiful, or Fair, or whatever. Lots of different titles for it. But I said, let me take it, and I'm going to mix in some elements from other stories. I'm going to take and make it my story, and I'm going to make it serve the purpose. So some parts, like her getting to, like in the real story, it's like she leaves her stepmother's house, and the next day she's at Baba Yaga's house. But I had to insert some of these other things, like the forest creatures and the water spirits, and all of these other things. So I made that stretch that out a little bit, and I added some other elements. So it's sort of a amalgam of many different stories that have Baba Yaga as a character. And having that made it so that you became intimate with her, and you understood this world where this was coming from. Because without understanding the world, then the fairy tale helps you to understand that world. And then you can understand the context for things like the hut on chicken legs, or, flying around in the mortar and pestle, or whatever. Then you want it rather than explaining it all. It just seemed too, didactic.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be fun.
Yeah, I love the line about, of course, Baba Yaga rides in a mortar and pestle. Who wants their legs flapping around in the wind in the winter on a broom? It's like, oh, that's
right?
Perfect.
Yeah, she is like a tough cookie. I mean, she's working with that spirit. She's no joke. She's a tough cookie, but I liken her to a kind of like a Olympic coach. If you're a gymnast and you're a kid who's a gymnast, and the Olympic coach says to you, all right, you can get to the Olympics, but kid, you're going to have to come and work out, 15 hours a day. You're going to eat, breathe, and sleep gymnastics for the next year. And then we can get you into qualify for the Olympics, and you can get the gold. I see in you the potential, but you have to do the work. And I think Baba Yaga is that 100%. She doesn't put down tasks as a spirit, and I'm a spiritualist, so I connect to her spirit, really connect to her spirit. She doesn't give you these tasks to thwart you, or to like make a joke out of you. She gives you difficult tasks because she knows you're up to the job. And then when you climb to the top of the mountain, when you get that gold medal, you go, I did it, but you did it because somebody pushed you. So she's a pusher, which is why she's pushy, I guess. Yeah. This is why that book I felt was a Baba Yaga experience, because if I had known what I was getting myself into, I would never have done it. But once I was in it, I was like, I got to complete this, because she's saying, do it. And what was the result? The book comes out right at the time that all eyes are on Ukraine. all eyes are in Ukraine at this, that how would I have known 2 years before when I started writing the book, when I put the proposal out there, that this was going to happen? I had no idea. The spirit knew.
Yeah.
And then it comes out right at the time when people are interested in this culture. So
yeah. And it's such a beautiful celebration of that culture too. And I do think that, with the invasion, so many people have learned so much more about Ukraine than they knew before. I mean, just even the tiny speech difference of people calling it Ukraine and not the Ukraine, like learning those subtle political things about, basically the imperialism of Russia and Ukraine that people didn't know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it is, like you said, it's just one of those magical timing thing that happens, but it's whenever it had come out, I think it would be a beautiful book, but it does seem especially timely because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was just, I think that when you, as you work with a spirit or deity, if you really are listening, if you're listening to them, you will have these kind of magical synchronicities happen because they have, who knows why? I mean, I can't explain it.
Yeah.
I just okay, I'll do it.
That's funny. I've had a lot of conversations with people who do not consider themselves magical practitioners who have asked me what I think magic is. And I've always said, I'm never sure. I'm an agnostic about a lot of things. And I said, I'm never sure. But one of the things I know that magic does do is it changes my perspective so that when those things happen, you see them. And then you might make different choices, or you may learn something that you wouldn't have seen because you weren't open to noticing. Because I think that's one of the key parts of magic for me. So,
I mean, I'm a skeptic too. I'm a skeptical person. I'm really skeptical. I'm always like, But throughout my life, as I was called to magic as really a young girl and as going into my teens, I have seen it work. And if I can empirically see something works, I don't question the mechanics. If I plug in my light, my, lamp into the wall, I don't need to know how electricity works to know that it works. Right.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing with magic. I don't need to know the mechanism. Maybe the mechanism is way more complex for my brain to handle, but I sure know if I plug in that plug, the light's going to go on.
Yeah.
No,
it's true. So now that you mentioned that you have other directions you might take, now that you've, cut down what you said, hundreds of thousands of words to this book. So what are you reading for fun or research right now to get ready for what comes next?
I'm deep in it right now. I'm so deep in it. I have actually done this. I'm doing this little crazy thing right now, which is I'm like, instead of bringing one book proposal, I'm going to bring 3 or 4 book proposals to Llewellyn to see what order they want to do them in, because I feel like there's so many directions that I want to go that are very different directions. I do have some Slavic magic ones that I want to work on. I also have some non-Slavic magic ones that I want to work on, but they're still kind of in that place where I'm sort of just brewing. I have been reading a ton of fairy tales and folk tales lately, which has been really fun. I mean, that's been really fun. Finding these old books from the 1800s, some of them actually, the original books I just purchased. Okay. Can we have like a book lovers anonymous session here?
We can have about addiction. Yes, we can talk about addiction. So, hello, my name is Victoria, and I have too many books in my house.
Yeah, I have. I don't have a fancy car. I don't have fancy clothes or jewelry or anything. I shop at Old Navy and cheapy places, right? But I will spend $100 on a book, girl. I will spend. I mean, it is like I sometimes go, hey, I'm not buying cocaine, but I am spending $100 on a book.
Yes.
I don't know. Is it an addiction? I don't know. But I just bought this book from the 1800s that I could have gotten a reprint of it, but I didn't want the reprinted. I want the real one. That's a problem. Mm-hmm. That's a problem. And also buying those academic books, which, you'll see a book and it's like $100 and it's a new book and you're like, damn it. but I need the information that's in that book.
Yeah. Man, those university press books. I've done
a few of those.
Yeah.
I know. I think Paul Grave, whatever, is in business because like these, oh my gosh, these like academic books. But I'm just like, okay, I don't do a lot of fancy things. My real treats are books and travel. Those are the things I love.
Yeah, me too.
So I'll spend money on those. And then, I'll wear a tacky t-shirt. I don't care.
I was thinking about the academic books when I was researching my fiction series. Like I said, that has all this stuff in it. I wanted this one book written by a Slovenian academic that was about, they had basically gone and interviewed older people all over the eastern part of the country about their magical practices. And it was impossible. It was in English. Shockingly, it had been translated into English. There was 2 libraries in the United States who had it. Like I couldn't even buy it. So I had to do interlibrary loan to get it. And I was still in East Tennessee in Knoxville, and the librarian at our tiny little local branch was like, I've never had an interlibrary loan where I had to charge you for the book. I had to pay like $20 to get it through interlibrary loan. And I was like, it's probably because they want to make sure you're going to give it back because there's like 2 in the country right now. So.
Oh my gosh. There's a book. Okay. If we want to talk about like book lust, there was a book that came out in 2020. And it's of Ukrainian incantations. It's written in English by a Ukrainian academic in Kiev. That book may have had 5 copies made because it was got there and gone. Mm-hmm. I have tried to find this guy and tried to find ways to contact him to go, hey, you probably don't have the book, but I'll buy the manuscript from you. If you could just send the I mean, it's like, I am like obsessed with chasing down this book, and it's not an old book. It's not, and I cannot find it anywhere. And it's driving me bananas.
Yeah, it does become an obsession. It does become an obsession because you're like, I know I need this piece of information, and how do I get it? How do I get this tiny piece of information? And like I said, I was so grateful that like because I had been at the university when I was in Ljubljana, I had some connections to people who were, bless them, were willing to introduce this crazy American woman writing a fiction book, not even academic, to academic people to ask them questions about obscure Slovenian folklore. And they were, I mean, just people are like, if you are remotely interested in their tiny, weird little area of expertise, they want to talk to you. And it was so lovely. And like, just to have coffee, in the square in Ljubljana with someone and talk this kind of stuff while I was there was amazing. But sometimes you want to carry that information in your pocket, and it's a lot harder to do.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I tell you, it's like, thank goodness for those academics who are passionate about these things. There's another diaspora Ukrainian American who, Sarah, I can't remember her last name. She wrote a thing about wax pouring healing. Mm-hmm. And, she did a video. So she did a video where she was going, and this was like 20-year-old video that she's shooting on like some, camcorder. And so that video exists out there. Her documentation. Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. It's like, I'm so thankful for these people that are just documenting these little things so that we can see them and share them before they're gone forever.
Yeah. I think that's the part when the 2 researchers I spoke to, one of them pointed out that because there is this resurgence in pagan practice, especially in Slovenia, but it's tied to this, unfortunately, sometimes tied to white supremacy, even there. But also
there's that issue. Let's talk about that for a second when you're done.
And that, this new kind of practice is overtaking some of what they know from the past. Like they weren't really connected. It's more reconstructionist and new things. And so they're trying to capture, like you said, this old knowledge so quickly before it gets subsumed by reconstructionist stuff or white supremacist stuff, and just capture it while it's still there. And but the white supremacist, that was a hard thing to hit in the middle of that, because I knew that there was a possibility, especially with Rodnovery and lots of that was can be part of it, but it was still such a disappointment. Like I would find a great resource and then find out, oh no, these are like horrible people. So So,
and a lot of it is made up, and there's a lot of lack of academic rigor when you look at those things. So when I was first researching, I had the same thing where I would come up. So Rodnovery is to people who don't know, it's the reconstructed paganism, but in a very sexist and racist way. It's a little bit like the equivalent that people may be more familiar with is like the heathen issue of like, there's heathens that are Germanic pagans who are just loving Germanic paganism. And then there's others who are white supremacists. So the same thing is happening in Eastern Europe. So I would see something about like Kupala, which is the Midsummer Festival. And I'd be like, oh, this is really cool. And then I'd see this like BS that was like, it's being done by this white supremacist group and this and that. So one of the reasons I wrote my book is because there's some really shoddy, bad scholarship books out there that make up BS. They just make things up, and they make it to serve their white supremacist ideology and their sexist ideology. There's a real patriarchal streak to it as well. Women are meant to just bear children. You can't do this and that. You have to be a woman, and only men can do this part, and that sort of thing. So another reason I wrote the book was to also have something out there that was counter to that. There's also other books. I think there's a lot of, shoddy books that people just wrote. There's one book out there that talks about voodoo, and they say it's Slavic magic. Caribbean voodoo is not Slavic magic. Just because you're Slavic and you practice voodoo, it's not Slavic magic. So I think that some of those things, I feel like this book was a counter to that. And this book was meant to be rectifying some of that so that there would be another resource for people, and people wouldn't be turned off from that going like it's a white supremacist thing. It's not. That's a new creation, and we need to get more information out there that's anti that. So,
and I do think it's important for people who are practitioners to talk about that. And it kind of goes back again to what we said, like these spirits are so old. We know that there are connections all across Europe to these, primeval spirits that that doesn't even make sense in that context. Yeah. Like this is made up garbage. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say this is that, if you really go back and you learn the historical information, the archaeological evidence is that actually the old traditional paganism was matrifocal. It was very woman-centric and very matrifocal. I won't say it was, I don't know if it was matriarchal, maybe, but it was certainly matrifocal, and women were not seen as these sort of chattel for men. You know what I mean? It's not, that's just some made up BS that somebody is trying to peddle as real, and it's not. And it's not, there's no academic rigor to it. No. You can't find any references. They just make up stuff and they go, oh, these are the holidays and this is what you do. And I'm like, where did you get that information? Where did, and as you're doing research, you come across this stuff, but realize that I think that's where, for most people who, if you go in deeper, you just be aware that it's out there. And if you see something, be a little skeptical, right? Yes. Say, where did you get that from?
I think especially if they're like, oh, people have been doing this since blah, 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 blah. And you're like, we know that's not true because we know about the Soviet era. Like we know what happened.
Exactly. It's like, so be choosy and be picky and be a critical thinker. I think that's one thing I would wish upon everyone, is to be a critical thinker with stuff, test it out, find out information, question things, because then when you do adopt something, you'll know that it's because it actually has something to it. It's not just a junk food.
There's some foundation there too. I think that's important. So we are coming close to time, but I want to give you an opportunity before we do our game of chance question to let folks know where they can connect with you and talk about any upcoming projects or classes or anything you'd like to plug.
Oh my gosh. Well, I have my center for all things is Parlor of Wonders. It's PARLOUR because I'm fancy that way. And Parlor of Wonders is my website where I have a shop. I make candles and oils and magical items. It's also education. There's a ton of free information on there about magic stuff, general witchcraft stuff, and also Slavic magic as well. And on there, I also have a section called Learn, tons of free stuff over there. But I also have a section with under the Learn part that is the workshops. And I teach a lot of Slavic magic workshops. When I teach my Slavic magic workshops, I like to bring in information from other countries. So I do get to do more research. So I talk about the practices and how they relate in different countries a lot of times. And so if you're Polish, if you're Russian, if you're Slovenian, if you're Slovakian, if you're, Serbian, Croatian, come on over. You're going to have a good time taking these workshops. I hold a workshop once a month through my shop. And then I also hold another workshop through Catland Books once a month on the last Wednesday of the month, not the last Wednesday of the month. My classes are on the first Sunday of the month. So they can find that. Actually, the quick and easy way to get to those workshops is by going to witchcraftworkshops.com. It'll take you directly to the page on my site that has all the workshops on it. So you can learn about the things that we talk about in Baba Yaga's Book of Witchcraft and get some hands-on practice. Next one coming up is about Vishivka, which is embroidery and the symbols in the embroidery. But we've got lots of cool classes coming up throughout the year and awesome. Going into next year. Yeah.
All right. So our last question is opportunity to talk about things we're not supposed to talk about, but we're witches. We do that anyway. So I'm going to roll a die, and depending on what number I get, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which one of those you would like. Other than that, there are no rules.
This is very D&D.
Yes, it is very D. Actually, my
RPG.
My die is actually from D&D set that my bonus daughter gave me for Christmas.
I play D&D with my kids, so I know all about this. Yeah.
A 3, religion. Okay, that's amazing. So as a witch of the Ukrainian diaspora, as someone who grew up, from what I understand from your book, Catholic, does your current practice weave those older folk traditions with current Catholic folk traditions? Do you still have that overlap in your practice?
I think nothing has changed for me. When I was a kid growing up, I loved all the saints and I loved all the pomp and circumstance, but I really looked up there and would say, like, how come only men can be priests? That doesn't make sense. That's BS. So I look at, I like the pageantry and I like the saints, because why? The saints are a pantheon of gods and goddesses, right? Half of them are gods and goddesses that got co-opted by Christianity. There's a huge thing in Ukrainian spirituality where there's this called the double faith, where people practice pagan practices under the, but they throw Jesus, Mary, and the saint on top of it. And so I don't tend to do that, but I got, I have my mom's old statues of Mary around the house still. And, I sell Mary candles. I sell Jesus candles. I sell that stuff. I kind of have a cooperative coexistence with Catholicism, but I don't like the religion, and I never did when I was even a kid. Yeah. I just like I like all the ritual and the fun, the pantheon of saints. So that's what I identify with. And that hasn't changed at all.
I find it interesting because I do think, a lot of people who come to witchcraft and pagan beliefs come with this wound from their home religion as a child, from Christianity. And then there's this whole other layer of people who kind of like you, it's like, I didn't really like it, but I don't feel oppressed by it. And it doesn't bother me. And I am curious. I think it's a family to family thing. I don't know that there's a deep philosophical reason for that. I think it just depends on how you grew up in the faith. And it does seem like from people I've met, I don't know, the joke about Catholics make the best witches, it's like it was always the pageantry and the ritual and all that. You grew up with that. Like you grew up with incense. You understand where these things come from.
Right. I said my first candle magic was lighting candles in church, right? You made a wish and you lit a candle. Yeah. That's a spell. Yeah. Just FYI, that's a spell. And so every time I go into a church in Europe, I will go into a church and I'll light it, or Mexico or Europe or wherever. I'll go into a church and I'll light a candle and I'll do a spell. Why not? Yeah. Ain't nobody going to stop me.
Yeah. I was going to say, when we travel in Europe too, I always drop some euro in the alms box and light a candle because, that's where my people are from and that's what they believed. And, I'm not going to disrespect my ancestors, even if I disagree with them about a lot of things,
I just think so much of it is paganism that's buried. I'm not even say I know, because when we start looking at the history, if they can't beat them, they join them, right? So they would look at something and say, well, they keep practicing this thing. Let's just call it Kupala as a great example. We're going to change Kupala, which is the Midsummer Festival, to Ivana Kupala because we're going to make it John the Baptist because you guys are going in the water. Right. So we're going to make it about John the Baptist. It has nothing to do with John the Baptist. It is a pagan holiday, but it's like if that calms down the church, they would just say, okay, we're going to put this veneer. Once you take off the veneer, you see that all this stuff is pagan stuff anyway. Yeah. There's very little in Catholicism that actually has anything to do with the Middle East and, guy from Galilee or wherever, it really has very little to do with that. So I look at the parts, I just sort of pick and choose the parts that I think are fun and resonate with me, and the other stuff I leave it alone, right? I don't care. Yeah. So, well, I grew up in a house, I also hear, I'm 58 and I was born in 64. My mom was an older mom and we grew up in a house. Like she's like, leave it to Beaver mom, but she would do all these magical things under the guise of Catholicism because she was Ukrainian. Right. So what happened was we were doing magic, but she would just say, oh, we're asking the saints for that. Or, she would put this veneer on top of it. She bought me my first tarot deck when I was 10 years old. We had a Ouija board in the house. She bought me a Ouija board. She wasn't scared of like spiritual, magical things because she grew up where it was meshed together. Right. So I hear these stories of people who are like, oh, my parents threw out my tarot deck and this and that. And I go, oh, that wasn't my experience. I grew up in a magical household. It just was Catholic magic. Thin veneer, Yeah. I mean, my father grew up Lutheran and my parents were older parents too. That's funny that we have that in common. And my mom is, Appalachian. So there were all these weird little things about that. But I thought about like, why am I a witch? Like, why did I discover this? And honestly, it was Christmas. That Christmas was so magical. There was so much magic. And I had all these books for kids that were like all of the different things across the world that people do at Christmas that were all folk magic, and I was like, oh, that's why I'm a witch. Partly, I think, just that exposure to magic at Christmas. Oh my gosh. Can I make a great recommendation for listeners? And you probably already have seen this book. There's a book called The Old Magic of Christmas by Linda Radich. I love this book so much. It is so damn good. That book fantastic. Is so damn good. I would love to get her on the show. I would love to talk about that book with her. That book is so damn good. It's so well written. It's totally readable. And it focuses mostly on Central European and Western European magic. That's definitely the focus of it. But the information is just great. Scandinavian too. Yeah. But great. And I just love that book so much. That book hit that, like, sweet spot of this book that I have a quest book that I had when I was a kid that was like a coloring book workbook that was all of these different things that people did on Christmas Eve. And that book was the closest I've ever come to that feeling of like that book I had when I was a kid. So good. I love that book. I saw it in my shop. I love it. I recommend it to people. I used it as a research. I taught a holiday magic, general holiday, Christmas, winter solstice magic class, and I just love that book so much. All the story and the lore. It's just the best. It is the best. It's a fantastic, and it's such a deeply researched book. I mean, it's just lovely. No, I totally agree. Yeah. Well, so there's a book recommendation to go out on, but I will recommend that people get your book. It is beautiful. It's magical. Like I said, I've already got it marked up and dog-eared just from reading for the interview. So I can't wait to dive in more and do some of those things. But thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you for being on the show. It's so lovely to meet you too. I've so admired what you're doing on Instagram around helping Ukraine, and just to get to talk to you was a treat. So thank you. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, what a treat to talk about books and talk about writing. This is just my passion and my love. And I'm trying to figure out a way that I can make more time for writing and less time for working.
Yes.
Like writing isn't working, right?
Yeah, it just doesn't pay very well is the problem. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press and is edited by Keifel Agostini, who also designed our logo. Our music is Voices, composed for us by Alexander Shnekar. You can support our work, get early access to episodes, ask your own death, sex, religion, politics, money questions, and get some free stuff by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/witchlitpod. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at witchlitpod. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and consider giving us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other witches find the show. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.